Yeah, thank you, Roz. And for any of you who have ever have the opportunity, Roz is a really terrific companion in the field. I think we spent probably 2 separate trips about a week together each time, nonstop, and it was just, the whole thing was just such a pleasure. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to my committee. And thanks to all of you for being here today. It's really exciting to finally get to share some of the work that I've been doing for the past 5 years. So I wanted to start off by taking you to my research site, to Kenya. And this is an aerial photo of elephants in a place called Lake Amboseli National Park. And when people think about Kenya and about the region, they often think about the wildlife, and it makes sense. We have some of the most magnificent wildlife on the planet. But when I was a kid growing up, it was really the marine environment, as Roz mentioned, that sort of captured my heart and propelled me into this career of looking at marine conservation issues. And so when I finished my undergraduate degree, I worked in Sri Lanka quite a bit after, and this was a while ago, so this is right after the tsunami, working with fishing communities to try to figure out how you move forward with management after a disaster like that. But there was always something that was at the back of my mind. There was something that was always bothering me. When you go to places of such stark natural beauty, oftentimes on the journey there, you see people living in pretty dire circumstances on the edge of these parks. And this issue was quite personal for me. My father's family is all Maasai, and this is a Maasai homestead. And so oftentimes people are struggling to put food on the table at the end of the day, and they're right next to people who have saved up their entire lives and traveled halfway around the world to visit these areas. This is a photo of my uncle here on the left, and he spent his entire life as a herder. And so he passed away about a year ago, but to this day, my family and I still get phone calls whenever a drought rolls around, and our family literally just struggles to put their kids in school. And so, as Roz mentioned, when I came to Stanford about 5 years ago, I was really grappling with this question: how do you reconcile conservation and poverty alleviation? And I felt very fortunate to enter the E-IPER program, where we are encouraged to take an interdisciplinary approach. And so I was able to look at sort of international development policy, and I look at food security in particular, and as well as fisheries science and conservation, and bring together these 2 worlds that I've been working in. And so the title of my talk today is Fishing for Answers: Can Fish Farming Transform Rural Food Security in Kenya? Now, whenever I tell people, be it in Kenya or anywhere else in the world, that I work on fisheries and food security, I often get this blank stare. People don't know what I'm talking about. And so I thought it would be helpful to just make sure that we're all on the same page and make sure that when I say the term food security, that makes sense. And so I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey through some of the food security theory. And I'll also touch upon why I'm looking at aquaculture in the first place rather than fisheries. So according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, food security is when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which meets their dietary needs and food preferences. So that's a very broad definition. And within the world of food security, we typically will break that out into these 4 different dimensions. The first of which is access, and that gets at the question of affordability. Do they have enough money in their pocket to buy food? Secondly is availability. Are there sufficient quantities of food in the marketplace? Thirdly, utilization, and this is something that I focus on pretty heavily in my dissertation, which gets at the question, is the food nutritionally diverse? And then finally is the stability of these dimensions over time. So to take an example, if a region is facing a famine, for instance, and donor communities come in and provide food aid, that might work in the short run, but ultimately, that's not a stable long-term solution. And so when we talk about food insecurity, what we mean is that any one of these 4 dimensions is jeopardized. So one way that we generally get at food security is by looking at undernourishment in the world. So here we're talking about calories that people are getting and hunger in particular. So this is FAO data, and it goes back to 1990. And what we're looking at here is countries in red have very high rates of undernourishment. So in the darkest red, it's 35% or more of the people are hungry in these countries. So this is 1990, and watch what happens as we move forward in time. This is from 2005, so you can see that those dark countries are starting to get a little lighter. So we're making progress in combating hunger. And this is the most recent data that we have from 2014 to 2016. And so the story that's coming out of here is that when it comes to hunger, we're making some pretty impressive gains. Now, that's not to say that the problem is solved by any means. And actually, across sub-Saharan Africa in particular, about 1 in 4 people remains undernourished today. And a large part of the reason for the gains that we've seen is attributable to the agricultural green revolution. And this was, it was a revolution in the food sector that got going really in the 1960s in the developing world. And it was, I think, one of the greatest examples of the ways in which science can really bring about transformational change to people's livelihoods. And so what defined it? This is an example that came out of IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. And they were able, in labs, to develop new strains, new varieties of rice, which were then rolled out to the field. Farmers adopted those new strains. But there was also, there's sort of a tight feedback loop and constant iterations. And I should mention that there was also a pretty enabling environment that enabled the progress here. So governments were supporting the rollout of these new crops, and also the private sector was getting involved pretty heavily. And so ultimately what you saw were improved yields and income growth. So it wasn't just IRRI in the Philippines that was looking at this. This is a map from the CGIAR centers, which is this global network of agricultural research groups. And there were really important innovations also coming out of mostly Mexico with maize and wheat, and all of these other centers as well, many of which focused on a particular crop. So despite the progress that we've made in fighting undernourishment or hunger, malnutrition and malnourishment persists to this day. So malnutrition, which is sometimes called hidden hunger, is caused by a lack of vitamins, minerals, proteins, and/or other nutrients. And if you have ever seen photos coming out of a famine situation, you might know of these horrible images of children that look very undernourished, but they have these bellies that just protrude. So that's called kwashiorkor, and it's a protein deficiency. And so that's one of the examples of malnutrition. So as of 2012, so pretty recently, about 1/3 of all deaths in children under the age of 5 were brought on by malnutrition. And even for those who are able to survive it, there's often a very long road ahead, impaired physical, psychological, and cognitive abilities. And so within the world of food security, we've seen this sort of shift where we're still working on undernourishment, but in addition to that, people are really starting to focus on malnourishment as well, so getting at dietary diversity. So this is where fish comes into the picture. In some parts of the world, fish is considered rich food for poor people. It can provide an important source of protein, fatty acids, and micronutrients, and can help ward off malnutrition. Now, fish, of course, is a very highly perishable commodity, but it can be smoked and it can also be dried, and so it can reach remote inland areas that are otherwise inaccessible and maintain its quality. Now, to show you what I mean by rich food for poor people, I think this map is quite telling. So we're looking at per capita consumption of fish here, where the dark blue countries have pretty high rates of absolute per capita consumption. But what I find interesting is these countries where you have these crosshatches, which you'll notice are relatively poor countries. And in these areas, people are getting more than 20% of their animal protein from fish. So in other words, fish is crucially important in these regions. Yet, I'm sure, as many of you know in this room, we've been facing some real challenges when it comes to fisheries. And so this is this is a graph looking at total fish production going back to the 1950s. And in orange here, we're looking at capture production, so everything that's coming out of wild systems. And what you see is about 1985 or so, global fish stocks, if you look at them in the aggregate, really started to just plateau. And now what I'm showing in blue up here is aquaculture production. And what you see is that the sector has just experienced this pretty remarkable growth, starting in about the early 90s or so, and in many ways has made up for the plateau that we've seen in capture fisheries. And many people are saying that this is the beginning of a blue revolution, similar in many ways to the green revolution that we saw in agriculture. But when you look geographically at who is it that's producing the fish through aquaculture systems, what you see is that this is from 2014. It's primarily coming out of China and other Asian countries. And very little of it comes out of North America. It was less than 1% as of 2 years ago. And Africa, all of sub-Saharan Africa, was about 2%. And most of that was coming out of Egypt. And so about 10 years ago or so, countries in sub-Saharan Africa started asking the question, what would we need to do to get a blue revolution going across the region? And so around the time that I started my PhD, there was a pretty remarkable program getting underway in Kenya. It's one of the largest programs in aquaculture in the region, and it's centered right here on the banks of Lake Victoria, which is the largest lake on the continent. So there are 3 countries that share the lake: Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. So zooming in a little bit. One thing that I found noticeable when I started looking at the data was that even though Kenya has a very small sort of share of the lake, about 90% of all of our fish comes from there, despite this long coastline here on the Indian Ocean. And so if you've ever heard of Lake Victoria, or if you've ever taken a course on sort of freshwater ecosystem management, it often comes across, it's often portrayed as an example as to what can go really wrong with invasive species. In about the 1950s, there was a top predator that was introduced to the lake, and it fundamentally altered the ecosystem dynamics. And you could do an entire PhD on that subject, and a lot of people actually have, and so I won't get into all the details, but sort of suffice to say, in about the 1990s, we started seeing these huge fluctuations in fish catch. And that had a lot of people worried. There are 30 million people who live in this watershed who are very reliant upon the lake. And so it all started to come to a head around 2008 when we just saw the prices of fish in local markets just spike, and people just could not afford mostly tilapia that they'd been eating for generations. Now in Kenya, there was more going on. This was, of course, the period of the global economic recession, and Kenya was very much affected by that. We'd just come out of elections for the president, and there was a lot of post-election violence, which is also something that we hadn't really seen before to this extent. There was a severe drought and food price spikes, not just in fish, but other commodities as well. And so a lot of the policymakers who are sitting here in State House in Nairobi were asking this question: what can we do from a policy perspective to get the economy back on track? Now, at the time, a lot of the economy was very reliant on agriculture. About 75% of the workforce was in rural agriculture specifically. And so a lot of the policymakers said, well, we see all these declines of fish stocks in Lake Victoria, and they were taking heed of the stories coming out of Asia and this ongoing blue revolution. So they said, what would happen if we put a pond in farmers' backyards all across the country? Could that bring about meaningful gains in food security? But there were a lot of unknowns at the time. This is 2008, and there weren't a lot of programs across the region, at least sort of the same kind of scale. And so they didn't quite know how to best approach this. And when they turned to the academic literature, again, there was a lot that was unknown. This is a key paper that came out this year, actually, that says that to this day, we still just don't quite understand the linkages between aquaculture in sub-Saharan Africa, and potential food security gains. And so I thought, what a great opportunity as a PhD student to actually analyze this program further and see what happened. So my research questions are, firstly, what are the food security impacts of Kenya's fish farming program on smallholder fish farming households specifically? And I use this framework from food security to get at that. So I look at availability, utilization, and access. Secondly, I ask, to what extent do on-farm best management practices maximize yield and profit? And I'll get into that later, and this sort of led me into this onto this journey of looking at supply chains. And so I spent a lot of time in sort of the warehouses of input manufacturers, which isn't something that I expected to do getting into the PhD, but it was a great experience. Thirdly, I asked, to what extent is fish farming in Kenya a pro-poor intervention? And then lastly, can aquaculture make a meaningful contribution to total national fish production? And what might this mean for the fisheries of Lake Victoria going forward? So just to give you an idea as to what's coming next, I will spend a couple of minutes talking about the nuts and bolts of this fish farming program, as well as my research design and methods. And then when I talk about the results, first I'll get at this research question 1, which is looking at the food security impacts of the program, and again, using this framework, availability, utilization, and access. My second research question follows that, but throughout the talk, I'm going to sort of weave in my third research question, which really gets at the pro-poor aspects of the program. And then finally, I'll take stock of national progress and end with some lessons for Kenya, as well as lessons for other countries in the region that are thinking about getting into the field. So the program started in 2009 and ran for 3 years. The government channeled about $73 million into fish farming specifically, which was about a quarter of this total economic stimulus package that they put in place. And so they were really making a big bet on fish farming and its potential. So how did they do it? Well, they primarily targeted smallholder households, oftentimes, husband-wife team. And what they did was they provided them with an input package of fingerlings, which are the baby fish that you then put into your pond and grow out. And the species of cultivation are primarily tilapia and catfish. The government also provided feed for an entire harvest cycle, which is about 8 months, as well as technical assistance. And in the course of the first year, they put in place about 28,000 ponds, not just in the Lake Victoria region, but all across the country. And given that it was about 1, maybe 2 ponds per household, you start to understand the scale of the intervention. And part of the idea here is that there are all these synergies. If you put a pond in someone's backyard, they have all of this water and hopefully can use some of it to irrigate crops as well. And then conversely, after they harvest their crops, they can use some of the quote-unquote waste product to feed to the fish. In terms of my research design and methods, well, I spent 5 years doing all sorts of semi-structured qualitative interviews with government officials to really try to understand what they had in mind when they designed this program, what were their goals. Researchers, extension officers, and input suppliers. But the bulk of my work was really focused on structured quantitative household surveys. And I was able to interview 1,098 households. And so through the survey, I was able to collect cross-sectional data. And so I was looking at people who were part of this program versus people who were not. And so most people in the country, of this 1,098, about 1,000 of them were part of the program, so only 100 of them had just come into the sector on their own. And when I started to analyze that data, what I realized was there weren't that many differences between those two groups. And what was much more interesting was what happens if you look at socioeconomic status. And so poorer households seem to be getting very different impacts than wealthier households. And so that's what I'll talk about. I also have panel data for nutritional variables. So I was looking at how are people's diets shifting over time. So I was lucky to get funding from a variety of sources. The York Family Fellowship supported my PhD for all 5 years, and then these other institutions as well. So I want to tell you a little bit more about the survey work. So I focused on 10 counties around the Lake Victoria region. And you might, if you're not familiar with the region, these names might not mean much, but one interesting tidbit is they're constantly fighting over who can actually lay claim to the Obama family. This is where the north side of the lake is where he basically comes from, and there's actually a town there called Obama that goes back a bit. So the other reason I focused on these 10 counties is because the government had actually done a survey around 2012 where they interviewed about 1,300 randomly selected households. And so I thought this is a great chance to go back to the same households and find out what's happened over time. So my response rate was about 82%, so not too bad. And at the end of the day, we ended up building one of the largest data sets in the region on fish farming. So to get at 1,000+ households, of course, I had to enlist this whole team. I worked with 52 different enumerators who were primarily fisheries extension officers, which ended up being a pretty terrific experience because they not only understood fish farming, and so when they're out there in the middle of nowhere doing a survey, they knew how to answer questions, they understood the nuance. But I think it was also great because through the sort of the stipend that we were providing them, they were able to get to all of these households that they hadn't been able to visit for long periods of time because of lack of government funding. And so in that way, they were also able to just give back a little bit to the interviewees by providing them with some technical support. So the survey was implemented at the end of 2014, early 2015. And as I mentioned, I really wanted to understand what are the pro-poor dimensions of this intervention. And so I broke up the sample according to socioeconomic status, 3 different categories, so poor, middle, and wealthy households. And after we did some pilot surveys, we realized it was very hard to get at income data. And so, farmers will often say, this was my income for the last 6 months or last year. But if that had been a particularly bad year, then that might not truly be reflective of their actual, longer-term income. And so I took this approach that looks at assets instead. And so what I'm showing here is we asked everyone about particular durable goods that they owned. And so what you see is, like, for example, the poor, 87% of them have phones, 88% have radios, and so you just work on down the list. Down here, we're asking about household assets. And I won't get into the details of this, but just for the purposes of the presentation, I think it helps to understand that typically the poorer households would live in a place like this where the home was constructed of earthen walls, maybe a sheet metal roof. And then as opposed to someone like this who lives in a home with concrete walls, a tiled roof, electricity, often a TV. So that's sort of the range that I'll be talking about moving forward. All right, so let's get to the results. First, looking at availability. So that, again, that's getting at the question, how much fish are people actually consuming directly? And what I found was, across the board, there was very little variation. So households will typically approach this the same way. They almost, I'm trying to remember the number now, but basically they'll wait for most of the fish to reach full maturity before they'll harvest them and then sell them in the market. But throughout the entire cycle, they'll continuously harvest smaller amounts of the fish and consume it at home. And so what I'm looking at here is that home consumption piece. And what I found was that across the board, households are getting about 7.6 kilograms per capita per year. The government had put this goal in place of getting up to 10 kilos by 2030. And so what you start to realize is that and this is from a single pond, this 7.6 number. So what you start to realize is that just a single pond can go a long way in helping meet this overall goal. And indeed, it actually puts them on the levels of many of the developed countries that we were looking at before in that earlier blue map on per capita consumption. So when it came to availability, they were actually doing pretty well. Looking at utilization, which is now asking the question, what is the importance of fish as a protein source? So I have I have time series data to look at utilization. We asked them in 2012 how often they were eating particular types of protein, and then again in 2014. So this is just taking a snapshot in time. And down here, we're looking at poor, middle, and wealthy households. And in green, what we see is, these bars are moving upwards as you move across socioeconomic group. And the green bars are terrestrial animal proteins, so pork, chicken, lamb, and beef. And so what you see is as households get wealthier, they're eating more of this terrestrial protein. But what I find more interesting is actually the opposite. So as households are poorer, they're more reliant on fish for protein needs. And in particular, for both poor and middle-income houses, the fish that they're able to get from their backyard ponds is particularly important. So when you look at the change in consumption over time, this is what you see. So across the board, households are eating more pork, beef, chicken, and lamb, more pond fish, as well as going to the market more often to buy fish. They're eating less wild fish, which makes sense. They don't have to go out onto Lake Victoria as much anymore. And so over here on the right, we've got aggregate measures. So the green is total terrestrial animal protein, total fish, and total protein overall. But I ask the question, are all types of farmers doing equally well? And this is what I find. So now we're disaggregating by poor, middle, and wealthy income households. And what I find is that while all of them make gains in total protein consumption in absolute terms over time, I wanted to know what is the extent to which the pond fish is responsible. And so what we're looking at here is the ratio of pond fish to total protein consumption. And this is what we find. So for poor households, about 60% of their total gain is coming from pond fish. For the middle-income households, it's even more, 72%. And with the wealthier households, even though they're eating more protein absolutely, it's not coming from their backyard ponds as frequently. So when it comes to utilization, whether you take this sort of static point in time or you look at change over time, my data shows that the fish that people get from their backyards is critically important, particularly for the poorer and middle-income households. Okay, I want to move next to access, which again gets at this question of affordability. If you become a fish farmer, how much additional money are you making at the end of the day, and can you use that money to improve your food security? So taking employment first, what I found was that when you put a pond or two ponds in someone's backyard, that isn't a great creator of employment. Primarily, it's households that end up running the ponds. Sometimes they'll hire outside workers, but by and large, not in significant numbers. There's a sort of seasonal component, and so what I'm showing here is there was a household that I think Roz and I visited, they were about to put a fish pond in, and so they would bring in laborers for a period of a few days, and they would all make money, but this was a short-term kind of gain. And so the government had hoped that they would create about 100,000 rural jobs per year through this intervention, but when you look at my data, what you see is that the gains are actually much more modest. Full-time laborers was about 5,600 if you extrapolate out to the national level. And in part-time laborers, it'd be about 14,000. So you see that that is a far cry from this 100,000 goal. Now, of course, when you're putting a whole new sector in place from scratch, and you're building it from scratch, it's not just fish ponds that you're looking at. There's actually a whole supply chain. And so I'll get into that in a minute. But part of the idea was that you would also create employment in other sectors. So looking at income, I found that when you control for pond size and the length of the cycle and species, most farmers were profiting within a band of about $1 to $500 per year, which I'm showing over here. There were some farmers who were losing money, which I'm showing in red. But what was really coming out of this was this sort of aspirational story. So if you pick up a newspaper in Kenya, or if you take a taxi in Nairobi, and you start to tell someone, you start to bring up the idea of a fish farm, people get very excited because they read the newspapers where you see these stories about how if you put a pond in your backyard, you'll experience this transformative change. You'll make a lot of money, and you'll be able to really, lift your household out of poverty. And this is a very common narrative. And so when I was traveling around, whenever I told people I worked in fish farming, they'd always get very excited and ask, should I do this? How many ponds should I put in? What species should I grow? And I, would have to just, tell them to put the brakes on sometimes. But anyway, this is a very common narrative in the country. But if you look at the median income, it works out to be about $227 per year. And this is per pond, which is about $19 per month. So, in absolute terms, it's not that much money. But don't forget the context. So these are the 10 different counties that I worked in. And what I'm showing here are the rates of people living under the poverty line. And so the government had set that at about $24 per adult per month, which means that what that means is a man or a woman was spending about $24 per month for all of their, to meet all of their needs. And so what you realize pretty quickly is that if they're able to earn $19 per month from a single pond, that can actually go quite a long way towards improving their situation. So as I mentioned, the government thought that this would really help improve people's food security. And so I asked them, how are you using this additional money that you're earning? And what we found was that people are spending a good portion of it on school fees, sending their kids to school, which is notable because Kenya actually has free primary education, but there's still a lot of associated expenses, and they were significant enough to really eat into people's earnings. A good chunk are also reinvesting in the fish farms, so there's an indication here that they think that it's a good business. But when it comes to food security, 6% of my sample said that they were using the money to buy more food, and this little tiny sliver here, 1%, said that they were using it to diversify their food purchases. Again, I'm asking the question, are all farmers doing equally well? And that what I found was that the poorest households are earning the lowest profits, and it's statistically significant, controlling for species, the size of the pond, and the harvest period. So, of course, I wanted to understand why are they making less money? What's going on here? I mentioned a moment ago that I started to look at supply chain dynamics, and one of the questions in the survey was, how much are you selling your fish for? And what we found was that the poorer households are generally getting less money for their fish. And when you ask them what's going on, they said oftentimes that they just weren't connected to markets. They would end up with the pond full of fish that were ready to go, but they weren't able to access a market that was either further away. They didn't know if they didn't have the confidence that they would get a high price if they took it some distance away. And so what they would do is they would just harvest and basically dump it on a local market for a suboptimal price. The other thing that I noticed was that there was very high variability in the yields. So some people were getting just a little bit of fish out of the ponds, and others were getting quite a lot. And so this led to my next research question, which looks at what are the on-farm best management practices to maximize yield as well as profit. And so this is where I wanted to get back to the Green Revolution literature for a second. As I mentioned, one of the things that characterized it was this tight relationship between research and farmer adoption. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that of those CGIAR centers that are all over the world, one of them actually looks at fish in particular. It's called the World Fish Center. They're based in Malaysia, and I was lucky to actually spend a summer working with them 10 years ago or so, is a while back. And so they asked these questions: what can we do at the level of the farm to improve yields? So this is sort of the Kenyan equivalent. It's called Sagana. It's on the slopes of Mount Kenya. And they'll take a lot of the practices and the recommendations that are coming out of World Fish Center, and they'll trial them here in the field through a series of mostly controlled experiments to see what actually makes a difference. And so looking at my data, I primarily wanted to understand what's happening with feed, fingerlings, and fertilizer. So this is a farmer named William Kiyama, and he was actually one of the outliers on that profit distribution that I showed you earlier. He was doing really well, and in this pond alone, he had about $3,000 worth of fish. So if you've never been to this part of the world and you've never seen a pond like this, you might look at that and think that there's something problematic with this picture. Why is the water so green? Well, it turns out very good reason. World Fish Center and others have realized that if you fertilize the ponds, which William was doing with chicken manure, that you'll create these phytoplankton blooms, and then all of the tilapia or catfish or whatever you're growing have an additional feed source. And so William is implementing a best management practice, and he was seeing higher yields. And so when you look across my entire sample of fish farmers, what I found was that it's actually statistically significant. So farmers who are doing something similar are seeing higher yield gains. Looking at fingerlings, so I really started to dig into what some of the science that was coming out of World Fish Center. And generally, farmers in the field will adopt one of two strategies. They'll either grow what are called monosex all-male fingerlings, or they'll buy what are called mixed-sex fingerlings, so you've got both males and females in the mix. And if you look at controlled experiments, this is from Mexico, what you see is that the all-male fingerlings attain body weight much faster than the mixed-sex fingerlings I'm showing down here. And the reason for that is there are two reasons. One is that the females devote a pretty high proportion of their energy into reproduction rather than just growth. But secondly, they'll actually hit sexual maturity before the harvest. And so what happens is they start breeding, producing fingerlings in the pond, and you end up with both the parent and second and sometimes even third generation all competing for food. And so you see an impact on yield at the end of the day. And when I looked at my data, I found that my findings were consistent with this idea. Looking at feed, so again, across the sample, there is a lot of variation in the strategies that people adopt. Some people will go to the market and they'll buy pelleted feed, which is often pretty expensive. But other households will just use the crop waste or even kitchen waste and just feed that to the fish. And what I found in my sample is that people who were using the pelleted feed were getting much better yields. And so a lot of the extension officers know all of this. And so when they go out and they go around to the ponds, they tell the farmers to use these practices. But what people don't quite understand is what the impact is on profit. And with my data, I was able to really get at that question: which of these improved management practices will actually bring in more money at the end of the day? And what I found was that the only one that really makes a difference when it comes to profit is fertilizer. And that makes sense. As I mentioned, oftentimes it's free. The farmers are just taking chicken waste and putting that into their ponds, whereas with fingerlings, as well as feed, they had to go to the market, and the prices that they had to pay were pretty high and were eating into their bottom line. And so this really gets back to the supply chain issues, and we're seeing a lot of inefficient input production. In particular, feed prices are high, as are fingerling prices. So to summarize, what I've shown is that when it comes to availability, across the board, farmers are actually getting quite a lot of fish from their ponds. And when it comes to utilization, in particular, the poor and middle-income households are really heavily reliant on their ponds as a source of protein. When it comes to access, you've got these outliers who are doing extraordinarily well, but even for farmers who are able to just make the median income, the median profits, that's still going a long way towards helping their household income. When it comes to my second research question, to what extent do best practices maximize yield and profit? My data shows that if you use them, you will get higher yields, but because the supply chains are still pretty underdeveloped, we're not seeing that translate into higher profits at the moment. So let's pick up on this third question. So to what extent is fish farming in Kenya a pro-poor intervention? There was something that I noticed in doing all of this work that was pretty troubling. As you go out to the field, you meet a lot of farmers like this lady who have abandoned their ponds. She's actually looking out at what used to be her pond. And she was part of the government program, and so she had received that input subsidy. So she was given fingerlings and feed and technical assistance for an entire cycle. But at the end of that, she did the math and thought that it was just too expensive for her. She couldn't afford the feed in particular anymore, and so she just decided to give up on the sector. And across my sample, in 2012, about 1,200 of the fish farmers were actively farming, but by 2014, about 20% of them had abandoned their ponds. When I asked them directly what's going on, 32% of them, like this lady, said that the input costs were just too high. 21% said lack of water was the issue. And then 23% said that they had problems with predation as well as theft. But I wanted to dig a little deeper and ask, what are the factors that really distinguish these active from these abandoned farmers? And what I found was that they're primarily poorer. The poorest of the poor are the ones who are abandoning their ponds at higher rates. They also are less, we're looking at active farmers over here and the abandoned farmers in this column. So they're less diversified as well when it comes to what's going on at the farm level. This one I found quite interesting. I asked about what is the extent of the support that you received. And what I found was that for farmers who had decided to join a cooperative, a fish farming cooperative, the chance of success in the sector was much higher. And this makes sense. You know, if you think again about the scale of this, you've got ponds all over the country, a government that's not quite ready to meet all of the demand for technical assistance, let alone inputs. And so the extent to which you were able to rely on people in your immediate vicinity seemed to make a difference. I also was curious to know what's going on with their consumption over time. So we're looking at the active farmers here on the left and this abandoned set on the right. And what I found was that they are eating less pond fish, which of course makes sense, they've abandoned their ponds. But they're not really making up for it by consuming more wild fish or fish from the market. And so when you look across the board, they're getting less terrestrial protein, less fish protein, and less protein overall. And this stands in stark contrast to people who are still actively working in the sector. So lastly, just taking stock of national progress. So this is a graph that looks at Kenya's total production. In the blue, we're looking at freshwater. So this is primarily fish that's coming out of Lake Victoria. And as I mentioned, we've seen these huge swings over time, in large part because of different environmental conditions, as well as overfishing. And down here in purple is aquaculture. And you know, the sector was virtually non-existent in the 50s, and only when this program was put in place did we really start to see a little bit of an increase. So back before the program, it was about 1% to the contribution of total national supply. But by 2012, it had jumped up to be about 20%. And so, you know, this little uptick right here still looks pretty small, but policymakers are asking the question, what can we do so that we'll continue to see this upward movement over time? In terms of pathways forward, so as many of you know, I live in Nairobi right now, and people still talk about fish farming like it's the silver bullet. And so I've had a lot of conversations where donors will come and ask, you know, what would happen if we put a program like this in place in Somalia or in Tanzania? What kind of gains could we expect? And so to many of them, I say the same things that I say to my colleagues in Kenya, which is it depends on your intention. It depends on your goal. So if you're trying to improve household level food security, then it makes sense to encourage the sort of home consumption component of fish farming. But you really need to do a better job at linking these poorer households to lucrative output markets. But if the goal is to actually stimulate broader economic growth, then a different approach is probably warranted that really tries to channel support towards people like William Kiyama, the sort of success stories, people who have the capital and are willing to take a certain degree of risk and to invest in the sector. And by investing in people like him, you'll really get at some of the supply chain issues. If you have larger farms, you'll stimulate the demand for the inputs. And so then the input providers will have the faith to diversify into fish farm input production. And so as I started off at the beginning of this talk, I was really concerned with the poorest of the poor, and what about them, and how do you get at them through something like aquaculture? And what I found was that I think if you focus on supply chains and you bring the prices of inputs down, it makes sense at that point for farmers like this lady to get back into the sector because she'll be able to actually afford all of the inputs. She'll be better linked to an output market as well, and can hopefully see the success that she hopes. So that's it for today. Thank you. I just want to do some acknowledgments really quickly before questions. Yeah? So firstly, thank you so much to my committee. Roz has stuck by my side for 5 years, and as I mentioned, is just a terrific person to have in the field with you. And you've just been such a source of inspiration, so thank you very much. Wally, Falcon, you're such a force in the world of food security, and I've really enjoyed all of our conversations over the years, especially about what it also means to be a farmer. So thank you for that perspective. Meg, I met you 5 years ago during my interview for Stanford. And I started off thinking about marine conservation and then looking at illegal fishing offshore and ended up in aquaculture. So thank you for sticking by my side all these years. And then Larry, who also joined my committee, I've really enjoyed all of our conversations about how you look at ecosystem dynamics and food webs and so on. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to Oliver for chairing this. So as Roz mentioned, Oliver used to live in Nairobi, and what we realized Friday was that Oliver actually lived basically in the same house, essentially, that I do today, which really just blew my mind. It wasn't technically the same house, but it was just one across the driveway, so small world. Thank you to E-IPER staff. Where are you guys? Oh, there you are. Yeah, and in particular, Jen, you have been the light of the program for 5 years now. You've been there to support me in so many different ways, middle of the night. Can't thank you enough for everything. IPER friends, colleagues, SES, and all of the lab groups that I've been part of over the years, thank you. To the funders who I mentioned earlier. And then also out in the field, I worked very closely with the Ministry of Fisheries. Some of these guys were the former secretary and the current secretary of fisheries for the country, and I was always so grateful that they would take the time to really sit down with me and walk me through the program and walk me through what their intentions had been. And I'm excited to go back to Nairobi and share with them some of my findings. So thank you to the 52 extension officers who I recruited, and the fish farmers and feed suppliers who made time to participate in the survey. I had all of this data from 1,098 households, and I could not have done this without my research assistants. These guys, Collins and Stephanie, came out of a grad program in Nairobi, and were just phenomenal. They really helped put everything into Excel. Friends in Nairobi who've been so supportive over the years. My 2 brothers, who I blame, I think, 100% for getting me into the fisheries world in the first place. They let me tag along on fishing trips from the time I was a kid. And these days, they're both working in the private sector in different capacities. But they've just been such a source of inspiration. Thank you to my kids, one of whom surprised me by coming. This is Anashe here, and I was actually pregnant with her when I came into the program. And she's just been such a source of joy and delight, and I can't believe that it's already been 5 years. And my son, Deneo, who's just born in Nairobi last year. Thanks to my husband, who's also seated back there. I met him ages ago, and he's just stuck by my side for so many years, these trips all over the world, and has really helped me get through these sort of moments of darkness that everybody faces as a PhD student. So thank you for your optimism. And lastly, thank you to my parents. As Roz mentioned, my mother moved from this small town in New England and moved to Kenya in the 1980s when she was heavily pregnant with me. She just had such a sense of adventure. And my father, who went from Maasai village to Harvard Medical School, and then back to Kenya in the 1980s as well to work as a scientist. So the two of them have just, they've done so much for me, and they just continue to be, I think, my greatest source of inspiration. So thank you very much. Thanks.
So we'll just take questions and I'll let you share.
Sure. Yeah, Jeff.
Thank you, Katrina. In thinking about your point about the algal blooms and the sort of putting nutrients into the ponds, it seems to me like, you could, there's a point where you could just sort of, where you can overdo it and just simply waste your money.
Yeah.
Because if the bloom is too strong, then you'll suppress the dissolved oxygen level, and then you can only support a certain number of fish. So
yeah, that's absolutely right.
So
Is there,
so just throwing stuff in there might produce a nice bloom, but it's not going to get you more fish production necessarily. So are there any studies? Is there sort of a little research arm where you can do rule of thumb, maybe suggestions to people about what the optimum amount of nutrient is, or even just aerating the ponds, it seems, could increase your output as well, right?
yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's something that when you visit these ponds, you see farmers who've definitely gone over that line who end up with fish kills just because, as you said, they just don't have enough oxygen. Because the cost of aeration is relatively high for a lot of these households, that's not a common feature that you see in ponds. In terms of best practices, so Sagana, that research center that I mentioned, is involved right now in doing some sort of controlled studies to try to figure out what type of fertilizer is best to put into the ponds. Is there a difference between chicken manure, cow manure, other things? And so I don't know if they've really completed those trials yet, but it's something that they're thinking about because they've seen enough farmers just end up with their entire crop wiped out, crop of fish, just because they didn't have enough oxygen. Yeah. Neil.
So I had a question. You were making the point that poor fish farmers often lack access to markets to get good market price for the fish. But presumably that's not being wasted. It's being bought locally by their neighbors at a lower price. If that's the case, is that beneficial from a food security standpoint, that it's actually getting fish protein to people who otherwise might not be able to afford it at the kind of established market price? It's negative for the farmers in terms of their income, but you're actually getting the nutrition to people who have less access to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the nuance there, I think, is really important to remember. And yeah, so if you're the producer, if you're the farmer, you're really just trying to maximize the price that you can get. And so there are a bunch of interventions in place right now that, well, I should say they're the early stages of them, where they're trying to put platforms in place. So if you're a farmer in Siaya County, you'll know what the price of tilapia is in Nairobi in a particular market. And so you can do the math to understand how much would it cost to transport it and would it be worthwhile at the end of the day. But your point is a really good one as well. And so I think that trying to quantify the extent to which local villages are actually able to get more protein from fish is important, and definitely something that I think could be the subject of future research. But I should say there's one interesting thing that came out of my field trip with Roz in July was that something that we weren't expecting. You see tilapia that's being imported from China now. It's ending up on the shores of Lake Victoria for the first time ever, really. And the reason is because the price is so low. The price of it is much lower than either farmed fish or fish coming out of the lake. And so as a result, people are just in an uproar and are calling on the government to put an import ban in place to protect the local industry. But then others, like these households that you're talking about, say, why would you do that? For the first time, we can really afford to buy a lot of fish because the prices are so low. So getting at those dynamics is definitely something that, it's tricky, but it depends on who is it that you're trying to target.
That was great. I was curious if you've seen parallels with the Green Revolution in terms of your finding with the access to markets for the poor households. Do you know?
Sorry, can you say it a little louder?
Oh yeah, was there a similar, like a parallel with the Green Revolution in terms of the access to markets being one of the biggest barriers for the poor households gaining profit in terms of the new farmers? Do you know?
I'd probably have to dig back into the literature to really answer your question, but I think that one of the defining things of the Green Revolution was that it really got at the access issue in some parts of the world, not in all. And so it's not that the farmers were necessarily just producing food in their backyards and feeding themselves with it, but they were able to sell it and really improve their income. And that's one of the main reasons that we saw such progress.
Is that access to water very in these counties?
So a lot of them are located, I've got sort of two tiers of counties. The first tier are on the shores of Lake Victoria, and so they generally had better access to water. And then the second tier, they're further away. And so I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but I believe that second tier of farmers were the ones who were citing lack of water more frequently as one of the reasons that they would drop out of the sector. But yeah, there is variation. But relative to the rest of the country, this area has a higher availability of water. And so if the sector is going to take off anywhere, you'd think it would be here, or central Kenya, which you might know is also sort of a rice-producing region. Unfortunately, the government did some sort of water feasibility study back in the mid-2005, 2006, and they came up with this map that has counties and constituencies all across the country as being suitable for aquaculture based on water availability, and I just don't think that, I think that they were over-optimistic in that analysis, and I think because of that over-optimism, we've seen relatively high rates of abandonment. Other questions?
Okay, well, everybody wish Katrina luck. We're going to